Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the third installment of our Engagement Experts 101. This is our educational series where we provide HR and people practitioners with a forum to discuss best practices on a variety of employee listening topics. My name is Steven Huerta. I'm the CEO of Workify, and I will be your host today. The focus of our conversation is a topic that I am super passionate about, and that's culture. In our sister podcast, Modern People Leader, we've had several conversations about why companies are increasingly looking internally at their culture. And coincidentally, when we polled our audience late last year on what you wanted to discuss in our next session, the clear winner was culture. So here we are. This makes a lot of sense if you think about all the changes we've been through with having to transform the way we work. There's been a lot of uncertainty, a lot of challenges over the last couple of years. And so from my perspective, culture is a really interesting thing. I find it to be a nebulous concept. In my experience, it's easy to coast through the good times, except when things go south or get challenging. It can expose culture challenges, even for the best companies out there. So I'm excited to have two amazing guests today who will share their experience with culture and leading in companies through difficult times. But before we jump into the conversation, I want to remind you guys of a few housekeeping items. First, we will kick off this session with a quick poll. That will allow you to provide some real-time input into the conversation. From there, we'll have a short 30-minute conversation with our amazing guests. Then we'll tee up an Ask Me Anything section, which will allow you to direct questions to our speakers. And also, as always, we want this to be a forum for you. So please feel free to drop questions in Zoom at any point in time. So with that said, let's get started. My colleague Oksana will be launching a quick poll now. So please share your feedback. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Right now, I want to talk about the guests today and our topic. We have two amazing guests. Usually we only have one. I was lucky to get a twofer, and both are friends. One is a former client, and both are very well respected HR executives and leaders. And a few years ago, this dynamic duo teamed up to launch Sensible HR, which hopefully they'll talk a little bit about. So I'm thrilled to have you guys today. Welcome, Kay Stroman and Brian Vogel. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Doing well. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for letting us chat with you today on this topic.
It's an honor to have you. And before we get into the conversation, I like to start our podcast with, I've actually stole it from Brene Brown. Tell us your story. How did you get to where you are today? What are the highlights? And Brian, I'll pick on you. Since we have matching shirts today, let's start with you.
Yeah. So, I'm here today after really been in HR land for 20 years, wearing primarily two hats. I've run the HR show per se in small and medium-sized companies, and then also have sat in HR VP roles at larger companies, most recently at Indeed, where I was for the better part of 4 years. And then we started Sensible HR, like you said, 2 years ago. And my entree into HR really springboards from my time when I coached swimming. So prior to going back to grad school and focusing on HR, I was a swim coach both at the club level and I coached collegiately for a couple of years. So I stayed with it for 20 years because my passion is enabling leaders to get elevated performance from themselves and their teams. And I've pursued this passion in a myriad of industries to include telecom, insurance, digital marketing, student housing, and technology. So that's the highlight reel in the story, Stephen.
I had no idea you were a swimming coach.
Yeah,
learn something every day. Awesome. Well, Kay, how about you? Tell us about your story.
Yeah, so I started out, my foundation is in human resources, but I started in HR back before it was even known as HR, it was personnel. So that tells you I've been doing this for longer than I care to admit. But my career has also spanned over that course of time, not just HR. I've done a lot in just general business management, including safety, security. I've overseen IT, customer service, fleet and facilities, all the way to full operations P&L responsibility as head of operations. So ultimately, I continue to go back to my roots, which is HR. But because of all the extra experience I've had the privilege to sit on both sides of the proverbial desk. So it's given me a unique perspective on what it's like to be a customer of HR. But it's also given me a unique, the other perspective of how easily culture can take a back seat to the bottom line needs of the organization. So ultimately, that's what's nurtured my my approach to HR, which is more of an offensive player with the business, because I've seen what it's like to be on the other side of the desk. I've done this in a variety of industries. I've been in durable goods manufacturing. That was where I started my career. I've been in telecom, cable, technology, software as a service. And this is my second foray into consulting, and I wouldn't have it any other way than, beside this guy right here. So, but ultimately, I like being in the speed and variety of the early stage, high growth companies, and that's where we primarily find ourselves.
Awesome, I love it. And so that's a good segue. So tell us a little bit more about Sensible HR and the work you guys do.
Yeah, so Kay and I first met 12 years ago, roughly, at an HR leadership roundtable in a chocolatier and wine shop. And I think it's our mutual love for a good red that broke the ice. And we started to talk, and we quickly lost ourselves in deep conversation about what was right about HR and at the same time so wrong. So it was this initial conversation 10 plus years ago that was the seedling for what eventually spawned Sensible HR. And through the pandemic, timing became right for us to come together and stand this up officially. So we're a boutique advisory shop that really adheres to a business first philosophy. We thrive in creating and driving people solutions that lead overall company success. So we specialize in working with startup, early stage, and high growth companies, not only here in Austin, but really across the globe. We have a client in Estonia where there's a critical need for strategic HR leadership on a fractional basis. So our timing into the market couldn't have been better in terms of the need for fractional leadership and fractional HR leadership. So we also do some project work and have done we have a handful of what we call bat phone clients, where we're on demand and they call us when we need us. So, and the story behind the name, I hopefully it was, so I pat myself a little bit on the back. I bought the URL 15 years ago. So
love it. I bet that bat line has been real busy the last year. So getting to the topic, because I know that there's a lot we want to share, and I have a lot of questions always. And so I'm looking forward to getting into the discussion. But I know you guys are both believers in the importance of a strong values-based culture. It's why I reach out to you to begin with to join me today. And I know you've also done a lot of work in a variety of different roles in the culture space. Why is this work so important in your experience?
Well, something that's pretty funny that comes up sometimes is people will say to me, well, we don't have a culture. Well, sure you do. Whether you intend it or not, you're always going to have a culture. When you get a group of people together, there's culture, right? So, in an organization, the culture is ever evolving. It's a living, breathing organism. And by nature, it's just going to simply evolve. So you either end up with something haphazard that may or may not support the business directive, or what your intentional evolution is. So whether your business has 5 people or 5,000 people or more, being intentional about everything is the key to the success, or conversely, the failure of your business. There's 2 sides to developing business. There's the what and the how. And, why culture, which is rooted in the behavioral norms or practices of the organization, the how, why is that not just as important as the what, which is your products and services. So it simply boils down to this: you're either going to be intentional and manage your culture, or it's going to be haphazard and manage you.
Love that. Looking at the how, and the how should be, as important, if not more important than the what, in my opinion. So I have so many questions already, things that I want to dig into, but we want to go ahead and share the results of the quick poll. Any surprises here from you guys? Looks like, most agree, 58% agree, 42% strongly agree. So 100% of those on the call feel that company culture has been impacted by all things pandemic. That I surprisingly, that I didn't feel like it would be so overwhelmingly in agreement with that statement. I don't know what you guys are hearing in the conversations, but there's still a lot of people out there that don't see the impact or the change, which is interesting to me. It's one of the things I want to talk about with you guys. As far as looking at, which is contributing most, remote hybrid working, the Great Resignation, that adds up for me. I think that if anything, the Great Resignation feels like a more of a pain point in the conversations that I'm having with HR leaders right now. But clearly, we are all still learning and trying to accommodate, the remote hybrid working. So I think that adds up. As far as those investing, 63%. I think this is actually a little lower than what I thought. I thought that number might be a little bit higher. I don't know. Anything in this data set surprise you guys?
Not really. I think it's, what to be expected. I think, a lot of this, the culture, whether we're post-pandemic or in the pandemic still, I think that's arguable, but I think we can all step back, whether in a work setting or in our own home settings, and can point to how much, as a result of the pandemic and all that comes with that, how our behaviors have changed. And I think that is more than anything lending to the cultural change necessary.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if the numbers were lower on the first question. I'm not surprised to see how high they are. I'm also not surprised to see that so many are not sure in that last question about what they're going to do or what needs to be done.
And why is that, Kay? I'm just curious.
Because I think it's first it all boils down. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today too, is, well, what do I do? Where do I start? And I think that's always the big question is where do I start? What do I look at first? And so I think, that's the top thing on everybody's mind, not surprisingly.
Well, you guys ready to jump in and talk about that? Get a little deeper in this conversation?
Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Let's go. Let's do it. All right. Well, first, now you guys, before we get to the AMA, my first question is, what are the biggest challenges that companies are facing right now, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think some of it the answers people will go to is in the poll. I think it's the remote and hybrid work environments, the Great Resignation. I think those are certainly contributors to what's facing companies right now, but I think it's something I alluded to earlier. I think the biggest challenge facing the organizations is the necessary behavior change by leaders or managers. And by the way, sure, contributing to that change is the blend you mentioned and what was in the poll, and just as a sidebar, we don't necessarily buy into the Great Resignation. I think we believe it's the Great Reshuffle. But those are just contributors, in our opinion, to the biggest challenge within companies, and that is facing facing those behavioral changes that's necessary by leaders.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like the more that I've had conversations on this Engagement Experts podcast or leader, the more I'm beginning to believe that there has been a lot of pent up demand for change. And this goes all the way back to like when millennials first entered the workforce. And I think what happened was the pandemic was a change agent. It came in and said, okay, we're going to introduce this external factor that is going to force everyone to change. And I think once that happened and we saw like, oh, wow, we've had to totally change the way we work. Now there's this new way. There is a settling of behaviors, right? And we're not quite there yet. And I think that there's a lot of decisions and a lot of change that's uncomfortable for leaders. And I think it's, as a CEO myself, I don't like change. I don't like surprises, and change is hard, right? And we're a small company, so for an even bigger company, I can only imagine. And so I think, it's not surprising that there's some resistance, but for me, that's the crux of what's happening right now. Is like fundamentally, the way that work gets done is changing. There's future change coming when we think about Gen Z. And so, some of the other things like other disruption that's coming, like, the leveraging, the gig economy workers, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what we are trying to settle into is like, how is work going to get done in the future and going forward? And so, everything that you shared makes sense. What is your reaction to the following statement? The time is now to prioritize company culture.
I think that I don't necessarily agree with that statement. I think it needs to be, it's about time to prioritize your company culture. The train's already left the station on that, really. If culture is rooted in the behaviors and the operating norms of the people of the organization, that takes you back to the how, then, it's past time. Because everything you do as a leader, from establishing your org structure to the people you hire, the frameworks you put in place, policies and procedures, to what you sell and how you sell it. All of that builds the framework of the culture of the organization, starting at the top. And so it's past time. It's, the time is now, yes, but it's about time. Because the culture's already changed. People's behaviors have changed just by working remote. So your employees' behaviors have already changed, right? So As a leader, you're behind the curve if you're not changing yours. So, the first place you could start is just by identifying what is it about these behaviors that has changed? How has it fundamentally changed? How has COVID and the remote work environment, and whether you believe in the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle, how has that changed how we behave individually and as a team? How has it changed how we just simply show up every day? Whether that's physically showing up or metaphorically showing up, how do we, in our feelings, how's it changed our feelings, about even working anymore? So, because, I don't know about you, but I don't leave work very often. It's wherever I go in my house. But, while some people are resigning, the vast majority are not quitting. They're simply moving on to other things. Mm-hmm. I think there was a stat recently, it was in Entrepreneurs magazine, citing that since the beginning of the pandemic, over 500,000 previously employed individuals are now working for themselves. I mean, look at Brian and I. We've been planning this for a while, but COVID presented us with a good time to go ahead and just make it happen. And oh, by the way, how we operate, the culture of our little two-person business is very important to us, and it's one of our biggest imperatives.
Yeah, I love your edit to the statement. It's about time. As a culture advocate, as recent as 3 years ago and like pitching the importance, culture used to be everything I talked about because that's how strongly I feel and whatever, or whatever you want to call, that construct of culture. The number of times that leadership, a CEO or COO would say, yeah, we've got that. Like, and it's like, do you really have that? Because, our data is showing that you may not have it. It definitely, it's about time that perspectives change on this topic. And so, on the topic of leadership specifically, why do you think the pandemic caught so many executives by surprise? Or do you even agree? Do you feel that executives were caught? I believe executives were caught by surprise, including myself. What was it that created this blind spot for us?
I mean, honestly, my humble opinion is that it's because culture, or the how, has not historically been seen as a strategic business imperative. The idea of culture intentionality has gained a lot of traction in the last 20 years, but it's still oftentimes an aside for so many business leaders, and for still quite a big population of business leaders. It's misunderstood as that fluffy, fun stuff that HR organizes. In reality, the culture of the organization is far from the fluffy, fun stuff. It actually resides in the hard stuff, the daily grind, where people live and work every day, including outside the brick and mortar walls of a traditional office, and I think others have pointed that out. People now even are bringing culture into the office. I mean, they were anyway. They were taking it home with them too. You can't just hang company culture at the door at the end of the workday, just like you can't hang your personality at the door when you walk in every day. It's blended. And so, for a lot of CEOs, that's just a little bit too intimate for them. So, for instance, the pandemic has forced us all to learn more about and embrace the idea of mental health matters. That's been a huge taboo subject that was only marginally getting the attention it needed pre-COVID. The idea of burnout and its impacts on a business's bottom line now are very real. They show up in some very real ways, and they can't be denied any longer. And I think all of those things have fed into this, like I like to say, SHIT moment, right? So we got to do something now. So that's, I think that is why so many were caught off guard.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Darren Murph, and he is part of the remote team and the people function at GitLab. And one of the quotes that that I've taken from that conversation was, "In the future, culture will be built and will evolve outside of your company walls." And that is like I think that's such a scary thing, because it's like out of your control. Like, at least, when people are, clocked in, like it feels like there's a greater sense of control of being able to like harness the culture and evolve the culture. But, to your point, like, now looking back, it makes sense that, this isn't something that just stops my behaviors and the way that I interact. Like, I was still emailing people even when I left the office, and working, grinding on the weekends and working in, more than just when I was physically in the office. And so while that was a like mind blown type of comment and reaction I had to what Darren Murph shared, it makes sense. And I think now that we're in this hybrid world, I think it's the reality.
Yeah,
for sure.
And so, how have you, shifting the conversation more to action, right? How have you helped companies, how have you helped clients work through their culture issues in the past? Like, where do you even start? Is there a playbook? Like, what advice can you give us?
Yeah, I don't think there is a playbook or a silver bullet, Stephen, to resolve culture issues. I mean, in terms of a starting point, we know it always starts with listening, or really listening to the employees, and really listening, only occurs if, you really care. So, yes, it may be about an engagement survey as a starting point, but it also is about having heartfelt conversations with employees and hearing what they have to say. We are of the belief that no one's going to go above and beyond for you if you don't personally care for them as a person. So committing the time to really listen and getting to know them as a person. You don't have to be their best friend, but you should probably know that they're married and they have kids, and probably should know their wife's name and the kids' names if they're your direct reports. And this is often missed, and that it's those type of actions and taking actions from their input that have the greatest impact, we believe. And that's the starting point, is to really work with the leadership to, one, show their employees they really care and that they're really listening.
Okay, so this is going to be the first item I dig into. What if I have a leadership team that doesn't get it, or they're not on board, or it's still a blind spot for them, right? They haven't had the "it's about time" moment yet. How do I go about engaging in the conversation, and how do I get buy-in that something needs to change, or that we need to invest some company resources, even if it's just the people team?
Yeah, I mean,
which for the record, I believe it should not just be the people team. Or, HR is always the dumping ground for any issue or challenge that is not business related. But sometimes you got to start somewhere. So just for the record, but sorry for cutting you off, Brian. What were you going to share?
No, I think again, I think you have to start with data. Data tons, and I think an engagement survey is certainly a place to, as a starting point, and looking hard at that data, and using that as a springboard to have additional conversations. But I think it goes back to really having those heartfelt conversations, and a willingness and having the vulnerability to have those conversations. I mean, really, from a leadership standpoint, and from a pre-pandemic behavior standpoint, and really policies and practices, if you really believe those things are going to work going forward in a post-pandemic environment, and 9 times out of 10, they're not going to work going forward. I mean, a good example would be, the pandemic and the working from home for the last couple of years has called a lot of things into question. Let's take the open office environment as an example. I mean, you talk about hybrid and you have people coming into the office. I mean, we have a client who has their employees doing that, and they still need to not come into the office for an ability to focus, because what they realized during the pandemic is they were able to focus more in a non-open office environment, being their home or their kitchen table, and get more work done than they could in an open office environment. So everything that seemingly was working well, I think that's all been called into question with the pandemic. And I think it's first understanding that and realizing that, and second, okay, let's all talk about this and have the real conversations about this, and with the assumption that what worked before may or may not work going forward.
And so if I to re-summarize what I'm hearing is, if data is a language that everyone speaks, particularly leaders, and if there's a way that you can get data, whether it's through an engagement survey, pulse survey, or some other form of feedback, that is a good starting point, because that is at least something that you can present to your leadership team. What I'm also hearing is sometimes you just need to be vulnerable and put yourself out there and start that conversation. And by focusing on the known knowns, i.e. the impacts that everyone on the team should be aware that we're having, because we've talked about them in our leadership team meetings, is a good place to start, in terms of positioning, like, hey, we may need to look at our culture, because look, we know we used to have an open environment office, and what we're hearing from our people is actually they have an open environment office, and that's their home, and that is more effective. And so we should rethink like what it means, what kind of culture, what transparency, if that's our value, for example, what that means in this kind of new working arrangement. but really focusing on those known knowns would be a good start.
Yeah. And I think, having those conversations and having that vulnerability it takes place more than at the C-suite level or in the leadership team. It's up and down and sideways across the organization. You have to involve everybody in those honest and, telling conversations.
Yeah.
And so if there's one action a company can take regarding culture, what should that be, in your opinion?
I think, again, going back to what Brian said and what you've summarized, gather the data. But, in doing that, I think one of the very first things you should look at is revisiting your values or your behavioral imperatives as an organization. What was important pre-pandemic may not be as high on the list anymore as it used to be. So what is the most, how have your values as an organization been shaken up? You can't just think that everything still applies as it did. And one of the best ways to do that, to revisit those, is to ask your employees for their input. Truly listen, and listen not just with your ears, but also your eyes. Observe what the employees are actually doing. And then pay attention to your own behaviors and your fellow leadership team's behaviors. How does that inform what changes may be needed? Maybe nothing needs to change, but I highly, sincerely doubt that would be the case, or at least the order of what's most important. But that's where I would start. Revisit your core values, whether you call them guiding principles or your values statement or whatever it is, your behavioral imperatives, whatever they are, revisit them. Do they still apply in how you are operating or need to operate today? That's where I would start. The other thing, going back to the leader, if you have a leader that just simply can't get on board with the change, is resistant, you also may have to make some tough calls. If you're willing to put yourself out there as a leader and change the way you're operating as a company, it has to start at the top. And if everybody's not on board, that could be a recipe for failure for any change that you set out to do. So you may have to revisit with people at your leadership team level. Are they interested in making those necessary changes? And there might need to be some tough calls.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. We recently had a conversation with Katie Burke. She's the Chief Human Resources Officer, Chief People Officer at HubSpot. And she shared with us that they have evolved their values over time. And one of their values was effectiveness. And they realized effectiveness just wasn't enough. And in light of everything that is happening and all the struggles that, we're all facing right now, the feedback, they looked to their people, and the feedback was, maybe we should change that value to empathy. And so they changed their value, which, you could argue, effectiveness is more business oriented, but given the current situation, given what's happening, empathy means more to the company today, to HubSpot. And I just thought that was a really awesome and a relatable change to the values that, you don't have to rewrite your values, right? A lot of the things that have made us great and made our companies thrive, still hold true. But I do believe that, revisiting those, particularly if you haven't in the last 2 years, I agree, it should be a business imperative. So another thing that was shared in that conversation, just in the spirit of sharing best practices, is the first step at HubSpot was getting their C-suite, or more specifically their CEO, on board. And once they did that, and that didn't take a lot of work, They're very intentional about their culture at HubSpot, but they put together panels, and they brought in, rather than having to define all these things internally, they brought together panels of other pioneers in this new way of that to come speak and share, like, this is what is coming, this is what the future is going to look like with Gen Z. This is what the future has in store from a hybrid working arrangement. And so we all don't have the resources that HubSpot does. They have $1 billion in revenue, right? They're very big, 5,000 employees or whatever they have. And so there are easy ways, like and there are resources that are available that can help us this sort of thing, which I know the three of us on this call would be happy to help companies, if they need any sort of kind of external champion to come speak with teams. And so those are just kind of two really, really practical things that that I thought would be useful to share here. And so my last question, and this is kind of and for the audience out there, we're quickly getting to the AMA section. So please start sharing any questions that you have through the Q&A functionality in the Zoom. If I call this a crystal ball question, and this is my curveball for you guys. I know this wasn't in the outline I shared. As it relates to, culture, if you had a crystal ball and like we could go to the future, what do you think is going to be the lasting impact that, everything that's happening in the world, what do you think the lasting impact will be, 5-10 years from now from a culture standpoint?
You were talking about this earlier, and it reminded me of a conversation I heard at a conference in Houston. It was a work futurist that spoke in 2010, and he alluded to what would be the most on-demand or the most demanded job skill in 2021, 22, 23, and of course, we're software development, engineering, and he was getting a list from the audience, and no one hit the nail on the head. And you had said it earlier. He predicted the number one demanded job skill where we are today would be empathy. And I think what we're going to see going forward is, call it empathy, call it EQ, call it emotional intelligence. That skill among leadership and managers is going to become first and foremost.
Yeah.
Love it. I wholeheartedly agree with you on that one, Brian. Okay, what's your crystal ball forecast prediction?
Well, I mean, he pretty much took the words out of my mouth. We usually complete each other's sentences anyway, but yeah, I think being able to embrace humanity. We've, again, when you think about people's behaviors, because they are outside the brick and mortar walls, they're already driving your cultural evolution. And being able to embrace what's happening and make it work for your organization. I think that's important, extremely important right now. And I think that's going to continue to be of the utmost importance for leaders, especially new leaders or leaders of new businesses as well. Not just those who are in existing businesses having to kind of harness the change that's already happening to them. So I think, whether it's empathy, embracing humanity, those are critical skill sets that I don't think they're going anywhere. Yeah. I think they're here to stay.
And the last thing I would add, if I were to put on my crystal ball, is I think we'll eventually get to a point where, one of the measurements of success for an organization, we have the traditional ROI, EBITDA, those kind of things. I think eventually boards will be asking to see ENPS, and that will be something they will be looking for and watching more closely.
I agree with that also. As far as, so we're now entering the AMA section, Ask Me Anything. The first question that I have for you guys is on the topic of revisiting your values, is there a way to get data? What's your advice on getting data through a survey on values? Is that something that can be done? Have you seen any work like that before?
Yeah, it's all in the way you structure the question, and Stephen, I believe, you know how that goes. Yes, there are ways that you can do it. And it's all in the way that you structure the question. What is most meaningful to employee? You can structure questions around what's actually happening in the workplace today. And that's where you get the data. It may not, some of it may be qualitative data. It's not always going to be quantitative, but that, you have to be thoughtful about the questions you ask around what are the behaviors being displayed already, what's already happening in the workplace, finding out from your employees, because that's where the daily grind is actually happening.
I think, the questions, you may not even reference the word values in the question,
right,
in the questions you ask. You may have to carefully word it where you're getting to what's underneath values, so then you can identify that, or those.
Yeah, and what I've seen for the companies that want to keep it simple and straightforward also is like asking 2 questions. What, of our values, which of these, do you see most actively in our business? And you can use like a force ranking question, where, your employees can stack rank, the values that they feel are most present all the way to the values that are least present in the business. And then you can ask the question in the reverse way. And so those are 2 really easy questions that you can include in a pulse survey that should get at other behavioral kind of aspects of the work. And you could even, if you are still working through your future of work strategy, you can include in there some questions around hybrid working and that sort of thing as well. But, how have things changed since we implemented, these policies could be another question that you could ask. But we have seen it a lot, and I think there are a lot of practical ways. And again, I think the 3 of us, if any of the audience members would like help or some advice on that, I think any one of us would be happy to help you with that. Next question from anonymous attendee. I work with hotels, and we have a few with super strong, high-performing leadership teams. Note a need to reset culture. Awesome. That's a good place to start. Revitalize, excite, reengage. What would be the top 3 focuses you recommend? So to repeat the question, I work with hotels. We have a few super strong, high-performing leadership teams. Note a need to reset the culture. Revitalize, excite, reengage. What would be the top 2 to 3 focuses you'd recommend?
Revitalize, excite, and reengage. Again, I would always default back to what does revitalize, excite, reengage mean to your workforce? Nice. What would, I'd go back to them. I'd ask them. That's the number 1 step I would take.
And when you say them, are you suggesting going back to the leadership team first and seeing how they define it, the employees, both?
I'd go to the employees. You can start with the leadership team, but I'd include the leadership team
in the employee data. Yeah,
because they're employees too, right? So ultimately, they may be the team that ends up driving what comes out of it, right? But I would start by asking the employees, what's important to them? What would get them excited? Because if the leadership team takes this on and it misses the mark, you're going to end up with opposite kind of results. and, then have the fallout accordingly. That's number one. Where it goes from there, that I don't know what 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever the next steps are would need to be. It depends on what that data tells you.
Yeah, and I would probably, Stephen, want to dig a little bit deeper. And maybe have a sidebar conversation with this person, and they're welcome to reach out. But if they're super strong, high-performing leadership teams that know the need to reset the culture, so what's really not working? Because if they're high-performing and they're super strong, then why do they need to revitalize, excite, and re-engage? Why do they feel that way? And maybe we're just misunderstanding the question, but if it's not broke, don't fix it, I guess. And that's really what I want to understand deeper, why they feel like there's a need to reset or reboot the culture.
Yeah, I think that's a great follow-up question to the attendee, and that's a great point. Like, if things are high performing, if the teams are high performing, curious to understand like why they feel we need to reset culture. I also think that asking, employees what revitalize, excite, re-engage, what that means today to them.
Yep.
I think is a very powerful thing, because my guess is it's different to what it meant before. And, but pre-pandemic, let's call it. And I think that, it will give some good data that could start helping you work through, okay, well, how do we reinvent or revamp, revitalize, excite, and re-engage? So all great siggestions. Moving on, the follow-up question, which may be from the same attendee. Our hotel industry is putting a lot of attention on retaining top talent. The work from home industry that the pandemic has promoted is something we can't quite compete with. Any recommendations on how a 24/7 operation like hotels can promote flexibility, work-life balance? So, and this isn't just for hotels, this is for all of the businesses out there where a remote or even hybrid environment isn't really a possibility, because you've got field employees. Your business has to function with employees at the office. So curious to get your thoughts on that. Okay, and Brian.
I mean, my initial thoughts are, a half a dozen questions. What's the structure of your workforce? And, what kind of policies do you have in place for flexibility and scheduling, things like that? What systems are you using for scheduling? So I came out, the last big startup I did was in the car rental space, and we worked, I think we had 21-hour work days, and so almost 24, but it was 7 days a week. And so we had to promote quite a bit of flexibility. And so we used an online scheduling software that employees could manage their own schedules. And there were parameters, of course, around it, but they got to swap shifts and things like that with people whenever they needed to. Some people, again, within parameters, they wanted to work a few extra hours, they could by swapping with someone, so forth and so on. So I think I'd still have more questions than possible solutions right off the bat. But I would start with going back to, just the mechanics, number one, of, what kind of workforce you're employing. Are they all full-time? Is it a mix of full-time, part-time? Do they, how are you handling scheduling? Things like that. Are you giving them freedom of choice in scheduling? And I think also cross-training, which makes flexibility and scheduling a lot easier, is something you could look at. But again, more questions than probably solutions right now. I don't know, Brian, if you have.
No, I think, obviously what you're pointing out is true. There's certainly industries, especially the service industry, where, work from home or flexibility and work-life balance, those are much more difficult. And I think, with, call it the great reshuffle and the labor shortages that are occurring as a result, I think not only, this is my personal opinion, not only should the customers of those industries approach with more grace, I think as an employer, you should approach the situation with much more grace. Maybe that's not giving them the flexibility and work-life balance they actually need. And maybe there's tools to Kay's point that can assist with that. But I think, again, it goes back to something we were talking about earlier, and that's really listening and really caring and doing your best. I think they're adults and they want to be treated like adults, and they understand the industry that they're in. They just want somebody to listen to them and work with them and coming up with the right solutions rather than just telling them, is my view.
I think that's all great feedback. Just to kind of reinforce, everything that's already been shared. I was reading an article that that most employees that are leaving jobs right now, the Great Resignation or reshuffling that's happening, aren't leaving for pay. They're leaving because there are culture issues or issues with management and leadership. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I always get sayings wrong, but it's like people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. Like that's an old saying that I that's holding up in my opinion. And so I think that it just underscores that while you're not going to be able to compete in some ways, that culture should be an asset that you can leverage to keep those people. We're believe it or not, we're entering the final stretch of time. So I'm going to move on. Thank you, Audrey, for all those questions. We have a question here from Sheldon. It's been said that culture has a workforce that feels respected, trusted, and developed. Might you add anything else?
Respected,
trusted, and developed.
Respected, trusted, and developed. I mean, the first thing that pops into my head is appreciated.
Yeah.
I think maybe there's a blend, a crossover between respect and appreciation, but I do think there's a distinction also.
I think I'd probably add cared for. Especially if you're in an organization, and I think every organization has customers, and you want your customers to be taken care of, I think you have to take care of your employees.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with the power of recognition.
Mm-hmm.
I think Francine also added that as a response to the question. One of the things that's very simple that we do is we use Slack as an internal chat tool, and we have a kudos board, and we leverage the kudos board as much as we can to give shout outs and recognize employees. We also have a weekly team meeting in which we have a section that's dedicated every Friday morning. Is when we do our all hands, and in that there's always a recognition section where we kind of recognize each other for all the work that's being done. It's one of those things. It feels like there's not enough hours in the day to get all the work done, and then there's like the work on the work, which is all these other things like recognition. So easy to lose sight of, but so important in my mind of having a healthy and thriving culture.
Mm-hmm.
I like that practice. I've done that in a couple of settings in the past where you don't start a meeting. You don't start the work of the meeting, and you've gotten through the work of the people, right? And so that is praise and recognition, and also opening it up to values issues. Mm-hmm. That may, if somebody has something that's bothering them, that's on their mind, creating a safe space for people to be able to bring up issues within their team at the beginning of the meeting. Get everything out on the table, whether you're happy, sad, mad, glad, whatever it is, concerned, get it out on the table and address that. And I've had meetings sometimes, an hour-long meeting, staff meeting, that might have spent the majority of it addressing, workplace interaction, behavioral type of things, which if you go back to the what and the how, that was not time wasted. It was extremely critical to even get to the what. So, I would encourage everyone to consider using that. Stephen gave a great example of how they use that as well, but I would encourage incorporating that time and space, creating a safe space, not just to praise and recognize, but also to bring up issues and help people resolve issues within the team.
Yeah, the last thing that I'll add, to Sheldon's comment, and then we will start to wrap up our session today. Trust, I think, is a big thing, and if culture wise, after everything that we've shared, if your organization has not articulated a clear vision for the future, as clear as we can, as you can make it, right? Because there's still a lot of uncertainty. I think that open and honest communication is something that I would add to that, because if you are not communicating and articulating a vision for the future, then what we're finding is employees lack trust, because they know that something has to give, something has to happen. You've told us that we would hear something. We haven't heard anything. I think, so many companies swung to over communication in like the peak pandemic, call it the 2020 year. And immediately after, COVID really, it hit us all. And then companies have had to over rotate to not back to poor communication. And so I think having open and honest communication is something that's important for culture these days, given everything that's going on. And so with that, are there any kind of final comments, any final words you guys would like to share, Kay and Brian, before we close the session for today?
Well, you took a question off script for us, Stephen, so we'll fire back to you. So you're a CEO of a company. So tell me what results really are for your company.
Results culture-wise, or just
in general. Tell me what results are. How do you measure success?
Yeah, so we measure success. We use what's called Traction. It's a business operating system, and so we define what our key priorities are. We typically do that in Q4. We also practice Agile in all aspects of our business. So we only actually do first half a year, second half a year results, because for us, so much can change over the course of the year. And so results for me, I break down into people, product, and process. And those are the three buckets in which, we measure results. And what I tie things back to are, have we achieved the goals that we set out, using our Traction operating system. And then we look at the second lens is the how that Kay keeps mentioning. And I love looking at it that way. And we reevaluate and we look back at the end of each quarter. We look at, and we just do start, stop, continue, a retrospective of the how. And then that's how we kind of recalibrate. Okay, how do we need to change as an organization what we're doing within those three buckets of people, process, and product?
Yeah, and I ask the question. I ask leaders this often, and I think what you're doing is on point, absolutely. But it's a little bit of a trick question, I will admit, Stephen. So I don't know who first told me this and who gave me this nugget, but results, people will normally, like CEOs like your type, will talk about, okay, I need to make these revenue goals. I need to make this EBITDA goal. Those are measurements of results. And it ties into our topic today. Results are nothing more than aggregated behaviors.
Yeah.
And
totally agree
on that note.
And on that note,
Well, guys, I want to thank you so much. We're out of time today. This was a fantastic conversation. Thanks to the audience for joining us today. Really quick before we drop, if I want to find more information about Sensible HR, how can I find you guys?
The easiest way is to go to our website, sensiblehr.com. You can, there's a contact us section, and we actually are old school and have a phone number there as well. So.
Love it. Love it. Well, thank you so much. And we'll keep our audience posted on our next engagement expert session, which should be next month. So thanks again, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.